This is where chronology gets confusing. In this lecture, we will stay mostly in the first decades of the 20th century, the same period as the Expressionists and Cubists we viewed last class. But today our focus shifts to artists who pursued political agendas or visions of utopia. This photo comes from an exhibit of Italian futurist art at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Futurism used to be a College Board favorite, but it's dropped from the list. I find it too influential, intriguing, and frankly, creepy to drop altogether. For much of this course, Italy was an epicenter of art. But in the early 20th century, many young Italians came to despise what they described as Italy's museum mentality. The futurists revered modernity, motion, and above all, speed. As founder Filippo Marinetti put it in the Futurist Manifesto, I've produced it here, a speeding automobile is more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. More disturbingly, futurist artists glorified war. There was actually a lot of this in the intellectual era of pre-World War I Europe. Social Darwinists believed that nations, like species, obeyed the law of the survival of the fittest and that the strong deserved to conquer the weak. Nietzsche's emphasis on embracing passion and exercising the will to power translated for many into the worship of violence and conquest. Some historians believe that these attitudes contributed to Europeans' willingness to be swept into a pointless and devastatingly destructive world war. Severini was one of the founding members of the Futurist movement and a signatory of the Futurist Manifesto. This painting presents what your homework reading, I think appropriately called a sanitized version of an armored train, complete with sleek cannons and highly stylized troops bearing rifles. There is not any blood and gore in this painting, and the colors are disconcertingly bright and cheerful. The reality of war turned out to be a whole lot grimmer. Note how this triptych echoes the form of altar paintings, complete with the memento mori in the predella at the bottom. We've already seen Kirchner's grim evocation of the costs of war, and now we see a grim evocation of its aftermath in a defeated and desperate Germany. In January 1919, a communist leader, Karl Liebknecht, along with fellow communist Rosa Luxemburg, led an armed revolt against Germany's post-war government. He was assassinated by right-wing paramilitary units. So let's hear from our next student presenter. Woodcuts had almost disappeared with the advent of what seemed like more sophisticated print techniques, especially lithography, which was so useful in journalism. So, why were woodcuts revived? Why were they so well suited to expressionist art? Well, note that harsh, thick, angular line. We've seen this in Kirchner's work as well. This is particularly suited to woodcuts. Kollwitz was famous for her depictions of mothers and children, often dead children. The tradition of the highly emotional German Pietà lives on in her work. The theme of this work was actually the carnage of the wars of religion, but it proved prophetic. Kollwitz's own son would perish in World War I, which only reinforced her commitment to portraying the suffering of women and children in a world racked by violence. While not in fact a communist, Kathe Kollwitz was also committed to depicting the plight of the working class. This is a somewhat earlier work and a sandpapered etching, not a woodcut. Reminds me somewhat of Courbet. And now we move east to Russia and the art of the Russian Revolution. Many Russian artists embraced avant-garde art for the same reason that Italian painters launched Futurism. They despised their country's past and they wanted to see their society and its art modernized and transformed. Suprematism was a Russian avant-garde movement that celebrated the supremacy of pure feeling, that is, of abstraction. Think Kandinsky. Its most famous proponent was Kazimir Malevich. Suprematism is also dropped off the list, but since it too was highly influential, I'm dropping it back in. You might ask Ms. Jacobs, by the way, why she finds white on white so intriguing. These two pro-Soviet propaganda posters both show the influence of Malevich and Suprematism. But once the Russian Civil War was over, communist leaders called for art that would more clearly serve the revolution and help build a new society. Pure feeling was not going to be enough. So let's look at a video clip describing Soviet artists' responses, an artistic movement that came to be known as constructivism. We'll get to our own constructivist work very soon. I'm going to talk more about photomontage when we get to Dada. You learned about constructivism from the video. Now let's hear from our student presenter. Eventually, the communist leadership soured even on constructivist art. Stalin, like Hitler, had no patience for abstraction, and in 1932, he decreed that socialist realism, naturalistic art that celebrated the worker, was the only acceptable art form. So here's a famous example. And note that this work fits into the same tradition of socialist realism, but with a more romantic gloss and more references to traditional Chinese landscape paintings. Away from the maelstrom of revolutionary Russia and post-war Germany, utopian visions often took on a more abstract utopian cast. Two examples of this are the organic sculpture of Brancusi, remember we saw some of that earlier, and the geometric paintings of Mondrian. Both artists sought a more rational and, in their view, therefore more humane new order. We've already talked a little about this sculpture. The video clip put it into the context of a move toward abstraction and offers an excellent introduction to our next required work by Mondrian. Sorry, my iPad's being uncooperative. The video did not include this label for the movement that Mondrian led, but you need to know it. I'll talk more about this style's wider impact in a moment, but first, let's hear from our next presenter. Okay, this is a little off topic and getting way ahead of our story, but Calder's moving sculptures, which otherwise are off the list, were heavily influenced both by Mondrian's paintings and by the early 20th century preoccupation with depicting movement and the relationship between time and space that we saw from the Futurists. This style's greatest impact, however, came in the field of architecture. I'll have a later lecture on architecture, but this work is dropped off the list, so I'll talk about it now, and only briefly. Here is a De Stijl house constructed in the Netherlands. Note the assemblage of geometric shapes. This used to be a College Board favorite. The same architect also designed furniture for his open-plan houses. Looks a bit like a furniture version of a Mondrian painting, doesn't it? And not very comfortable. In my next lecture, I leave this logical utopian world and take us to the wild worlds of Dada and Surrealism.